Because you don't want to be on a spaceship by yourself for 2 years.
Right.
Even
with just 4 other people.
Especially with just 4 other people.
Yeah.
You'll murder each other.
Yeah. And you can't do that.
Hello, and welcome to the Dinner Geek podcast, the only podcast fueled completely by ADHD.
Correct.
Today, Mr. Croshaw and I are going to be eating some gargantuan black hole linguine, some stuff that's totally cornbread,
yeah,
and cryogenic water.
Yes, cryogenic fluid.
Yes. The movie that we are going to be talking about and geeking about today is 2014, I believe, Interstellar, directed by Christopher Nolan and starring my man crush, Matthew McConaughey, who is all right.
And Anne Hathaway, who is another very cool person. And Michael Caine.
And Michael Caine.
And Matt Damon.
Matt Damon gets stranded on a planet in this one, too.
And has to be saved. We'll probably talk about The Martian eventually.
I would expect.
Yeah.
At the rate at which we go of one every 6 months by the time we retire.
By the way, if you haven't seen the movie, this is kind of a little bit of a late spoiler, but yeah, Matt Damon's in it.
Yeah.
So.
And he's lost on a planet.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of you who have not seen Interstellar is a movie where the Earth is in trouble. There is a thing called blight. We will talk about blight in a second. And blight is a organism.
Some kind of infection.
Somehow we don't know where it's from. They don't know how it came to exist, but it's killing all of the plants.
Yep.
And without plants, we die.
Yep.
And so the Earth is going to die, and they find a gravitational anomaly out by Saturn, which turns out to be a wormhole. And on the other side of that wormhole is another galaxy, and in that galaxy there are some planets that might be habitable to life. And Matthew McConaughey and Anne Hathaway and some funny robots.
And a couple of other people.
Whose names, I remember the names of the characters. A guy named Brom and fodder for action scene.
Yeah, exactly.
Number 1.
Yeah.
If you don't know the name of the character, by the time you get an hour into the movie, that character is unfortunately going to not make it.
Yeah.
And anyway, so they go over there and they are trying to see if any of the planets are habitable, and if they are, they'll see if they can get the people there. But there is a problem that getting humans off of Earth is very, very difficult, and they have to figure out the problem of gravity.
Yeah.
So there's the basics of it. What do you want to talk about first?
Well, I think that the natural place to start is at the beginning of the movie. I like that at the beginning of the movie, it seems like a documentary about the Dust Bowl.
Yeah.
Like you think that they're going to start talking about the Dust Bowl in the 1920s, 1930s Dust Bowl, but then they transition to no, this is actually in the future. Humanity is on the brink of collapse because there's not enough food, because there's been this infection. Again, we don't know where it came from, but they do mention that it has some kind of metabolic pathway that involves nitrogen, which is super interesting.
And super weird.
Yes. Because
nothing primarily that I'm aware of respirates with nitrogen.
Right, not like respiration, but we do know about the nitrogen fixation process.
Absolutely.
So like certain bacteria as well as fungus that have kind of worked with that bacteria take nitrogen out of the air and fix it in molecules inside themselves, and that's how we end up with nitrogen in the soil, which is super important.
There's also, there's part of that. Another thing that happens, and when I was a farmer for a billion years, we loved lightning storms. Because what will happen in a lightning storm is it will pull, not just that it rains, but when the lightning strikes, it ionizes the oxygen and the nitrogen in the air. It's why you can smell lightning. It makes that ozone smell. But it also energizes the nitrogen and makes it so it can get into the soil, and then the rain will bring it down. because otherwise nitrogen doesn't want to react with anything, and that increases the amount of nitrogen in the soil. It's like free fertilizer every time it rains.
Well, what happens is the energy from the lightning strike essentially through electrolysis splits that nitrogen, which is very hard to do.
Yeah.
Nitrogen is a very strong triple covalent bond, and so it's very difficult to split that bond. But when it splits it, and there's a lot of moisture in the air, which happens a lot during lightning storms, that means you've got free oxygen and free hydrogen. A lot of those get split apart as well, so you get ammonia in the air as well.
I didn't know about the ammonia part.
Yeah. So
does the nitrogen?
Because ammonia is NH3.
What's the chemical makeup of ammonia?
NH3.
NH3. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So it brings that down.
Yeah, and you get nitrogen dioxide and nitrous oxide as well in the air, just because these atoms don't want to be alone.
Yeah.
And so when they're split up by that high energy in the lightning, then the nitrogens find other nitrogens. But sometimes they'll find oxygens and hydrogens and so forth. So yeah, that's super important stuff. But I mean, you can see why this blight would be so dangerous, because our atmosphere is 79% nitrogen. So if you have something that's respirating using such a common resource, 79%. I mean, that's like it's like when during the Carboniferous, when there was so much more oxygen, you ended up with like griffin flies.
Yeah, that are about that big.
Oh no, longer than that.
Really?
Like, yeah,
they got that big.
Yeah.
For some reason, I had them as like 18 inches in my brain.
No, griffin flies had wingspans that got up to almost 2 meters.
Good God.
Yeah, they're like albatross. No, not albatross, but like large seagull size dragonflies. But so yeah, with a resource so as abundant as nitrogen, obviously this would be huge, and so it kills off everything, just spreads throughout the whole, and it doesn't really even have to infect it, right? It could just be like almost like it could just displace it, right?
Or it could absorb it. So we talked about this in my science fiction class. There is a line in the movie where they say the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere, and it's 2% higher than the actual amount of nitrogen that is really in the atmosphere. And if I know anything about Christopher Nolan, that is not a mistake, that is on purpose, which tells me that they are releasing nitrogen from another source.
Maybe
in order to
soil.
increase it, which I would think it'd be in soil, or my other thought was it breaks down proteins. Because proteins have nitrogen.
Have a lot of nitrogen.
And
same with DNA. Like
and when
nucleic acids.
Yeah. And when you look at what it does, like in farming, when you have a blight, it's not just a disease, it's a disease that destroys the plant. Blight goes in, and your plants don't just die, they turn black. It's like they're being eaten, and a lot of times it's a fungus or a virus that goes in there, and it's destroying the cells. And so if it's not only respirating it, but it's pulling the nitrogen out of the proteins of cellulose, that there's a lot of cellulose out there.
That would make a lot more sense, actually, in terms of maybe it's not respirating the atmospheric. If it's breaking down the nitrogen in the proteins themselves.
Yeah. Or maybe a combination of both or something like that.
So it would be terrible. And they mentioned that the neighbor has the harvest of okra, right? The final okra harvest ever.
And the stuff that is left over is corn, which is why we have real cornbread.
Yes, very real cornbread. I totally didn't screw up and not make cornbread.
Makes sense. So corn is an incredibly hardy plant.
Yeah.
There's a reason corn is a grass.
Yep.
And grasses are able to survive all sorts of things. They have a different type of structure and it's in their cells, and the way in which they transfer water is different than, say, like a tomato plant, which is a nightshade.
And they grow really fast.
And they grow crazy fast, and they can, like, I've had tomatoes die when I was a farmer, get frost at 35 degrees. Which should not happen.
Right.
And I've had corn survive single or double, like barely double digits.
Right. Yeah, and so corn is being as hardy as it is, And what's nice too is we can make like everything out of corn.
Oh, corn's awesome.
You know, we use corn for, high fructose corn syrup, but of course, just corn meal and corn, we can make kind of a flour out of it.
We feed cows with it.
We feed cows with it. We can also make fuel, right? Ethanol and so you can make all sorts of stuff. Really, corn, you can run the whole dietary spectrum with corn. So it's good that was the thing that survived.
Yeah. I read a statistic once that somewhere around like 50 to 55% of the total acreage of land in the U.S. is devoted to cows. Whether the cows are on it or it's what they're eating.
Yep.
And the vast majority of the food that cows eat in the U.S. is corn.
Yeah.
There's a reason why Ohio and Kansas and Oklahoma, when you think of it, is just
cornfields. Yeah, Iowa. Yeah, I remember I went to the Iowa State Fair when I was driving across the country when I was 18 with my parents. Holy crap, so much corn. Like the amount of corn at this state fair. And this is the place of the United States where they take state fairs like real serious. And and the cornfields that they drive through in the movie, it would make sense. But one thing that I actually wanted to mention as well about kind of the situation that they're in, I think it's fascinating that the whole scene where he goes to the school because he's being called in as teachers. Like, I find
my gosh, I know exactly what part you're talking about. And
it's infuriating, right? But there's this part, they're like, we didn't run out of planes, we ran out of food, and that they don't need engineers anymore, they need farmers. But like, I don't know,
engineers built the things that make farming more efficient.
And we see that with Cooper, automating all of his tractors and doing everything with he's a very smart guy. We know he was a test pilot.
Cooper is Matthew McConaughey.
Yes.
He is the main character story, and his backstory is he used to be a pilot for either the Air Force or NASA. I'm not sure which.
I think that it's NASA because later on they mentioned that in the testing of the Rangers, that it was in the testing of the Rangers that he had his accident. So,
but there's, the Air Force and NASA work together a lot.
Right.
So I don't know. But anyway, he was a pilot, and now he's a farmer, and he does not like being a farmer. So, but he uses his brains to be better at it. Anyway, so world's dying. Something that eats nitrogen, which is weird because nitrogen is
difficult to use chemically.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a reason why, like, if you open up a bag of like potato chips, the air in there is probably nitrogen because it's inert. Yeah, it doesn't react with things, and that's why it will stay good forever. If you open up a bag of like that freeze-dried food that you either take camping or save for when the apocalypse happens, that air in there is nitrogen.
Right. Well,
and it'll stay good for 15 years.
Yeah. Well, because nitrogen, unlike oxygen or carbon dioxide, is not going to be respirated by something that would spoil the food. So yeah, and then I think it's fascinating as well the way that Cooper is raising his kids, right? So he's got the two kids, Murphy, who becomes very important, and then the older brother's name escapes me. It's not.
I watched this last night.
Yeah.
He has a kid named Jess.
So his daughter Murphy comes in asking about, like, I've got this ghost, right? And Cooper is like, don't call it a ghost. Let's find the evidence. And that's one of my favorite parts is as a science educator and a dad is like, let's not jump to conclusions just because we don't know everything.
Let's write down what we have.
Right.
Make logical conclusions based off of the evidence.
Right. And all that she knows is that something is happening in her room where there's stuff is falling and there's just weird things happening. I also love that she has a little model lunar lander that breaks, and he's like, what happened? What did you do to my model? And
it's the ghost.
Yeah, the ghost pushed it off the shelf or whatever. And of course, foreshadowing, she comes in and she says to him, I thought that you were my ghost, which is a great foreshadow to
the end
the fact that it is actually, the ghost.
Which brings us to the next part. So
Yeah.
he does not believe that there's this ghost, and she tells him that she thinks that it is trying to communicate with him via code, and she's like, maybe Morse code. And he's like, what are you talking about? And they go in, and one of the things that's going on is there's dust everywhere.
Dust storms, yeah.
If you were to take all of the plants and they die, the dirt is going to go somewhere, and it's
Everywhere.
always windy in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And so there are these dust storms, and dust is always falling. And they go in, they notice that the dust is not falling equally, which is insane.
Yeah, because things should spread out evenly across the surface.
Yeah, gravity is such that on a surface and in the levels that we are used to, from here to here, the gravity is essentially exactly the same.
Yeah.
And stuff shouldn't fall more here, 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 and here unless there is a reason, some sort of force acting upon it.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks perhaps it's something magnetic, but there's nothing magnetic going on there. You can take a compass in there, and it's not going to flip out.
Right, and
It's
dust,
definitely not the strong or the weak force because those work on the scale of atoms.
right, and dust isn't. I mean, there's a couple of magnetic particles in
No.
dust, but the only thing that's really going to affect something like that would be gravity, and that's what they come to the conclusion.
Which would mean that the relative gravity of this piece, 1 inch wide here, is different than the relative gravity here, which, as far as we know, cannot happen.
Right.
Gravity has a constant, the gravitational constant that is in, I can't remember what the number is off the top of my head.
It's times 10 to the negative 11th. I know that it's a very small number.
6.42 times 10 to the negative 11th or something like that.
That sounds
Anyway,
close.
it's this itty bitty teeny tiny number, but that little teeny tiny number is essential to figuring out the amount of gravity in any given area. If you want to figure out the gravity of Earth, you take how big it is, how far away you are away from it, and
How
the gravitation.
massive it is.
Yeah, massive, that's a better way to put it.
Yes.
How far away you are from the center of it,
of its gravity.
and the gravitational constant, and you can figure out what the gravity would be here, or you can figure out, if you know the gravity, the mass of something, or how far away you are, or any of those things. So for
have
it to
a
be different
different
here to
gravity.
here,
Something
breaks our laws of the way we understand
because
way
the
universe
mass
works.
would have to be different.
Yes.
Right? Because the distance to the center, either that or there would have to be some kind of distant, like the space-time itself has been changed, so there would be a distance shift to the center of mass.
Wormholes?
Yes, exactly. So, obviously something very strange is happening with this gravity, something that we really don't understand as far as our understanding of gravity goes, like quantum gravity, which I'm not going to. Quantum gravity.
The people who study it don't
breaks my
understand
brain.
quantum gravity.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So for that to happen would be just an insane occurrence. But then they find out it's binary code, and it's a latitude and a longitude. So they go to the latitude, longitude, and find out that it's NASA.
Yeah.
Working out of the public eye, underground.
And when they find out, then they ask them, how did you get here? And he eventually says there was a gravitational anomaly. They start to listen to him.
Yeah, because they know about the gravitational anomaly out there. No one else does. So, obviously, there's a connection between how gravity is behaving that they're studying out there and what they're experiencing, at the Cooper home.
Yeah.
Which, obviously, I'm sure that they would have, thought, well, it was specific for the Cooper family, right? Because Cooper being a test pilot, something, he was chosen, and they talk about why did they choose me, and later on. So yeah, and they meet Dr. Brand, who is played by Michael Caine.
Alfred in the Christopher Nolan Batman.
Yes.
Also, he played Austin Powers' dad in Goldmember.
Yeah, I really think that he's been in so many
He's been in
movies.
so many things. Basically, I expect Michael Caine to be in half of everything I watch. If they need a charismatic British dude.
Yeah, like an older, gentlemanly British man. Yeah, Christopher Nolan loves him too.
Yeah.
He was in the Prestige. Obviously, he was in the Dark Knight trilogy.
Yeah.
He's been in just about every Christopher Nolan film. So, but when they start talking to him about what their plan is, and we talked about the plan earlier about getting, as many people off of the Earth through this wormhole to a habitable planet in this other galaxy, which is, I think that we failed to mention, is orbiting. All of these are orbiting a black hole.
Yes, this will become very important.
Yeah, and so it's really fascinating. And then Dr. Brand's daughter, who is also Dr. Brand.
Yes, Anne Hathaway.
Yes, Anne Hathaway's character is part of this program to send people to go investigate whether or not these planets are habitable. So I think that it's really fascinating, the idea of exploring space, obviously exoplanetology, that's one of my very favorite things, finding other habitable worlds. What I think is really fascinating, though, is to be able to study these worlds from Earth through a black hole that's in our solar system but leads to a completely different solar system. Not just a different stellar system, but it's in a completely different galaxy.
I don't know if it does. I don't remember if it says which one it is. But
I don't think it does. I think they just say that it's a different galaxy.
Which, at the links we're talking about is, what is it? M57.
Yeah.
Is, I think, 57 million light years away from us,
really?
or something like that.
That'd be an interesting.
I was watching a thing on black holes last night, and is that the one that we took the photo of the supermassive black hole at the center of?
Yeah, so I believe that sounds correct. Yeah. I know that
it's in the local cluster and local cluster.
The local group.
And like Andromeda's in that, and it's like 250 million light years away.
Right, which is just crazy.
And we are. What's the math? Every minute we're getting like 40,000 kilometers closer to it. And it would take us a few billion years till we run into it.
Yeah, Andromeda, but the thing is, like, what's interesting, though, is that these distances are so vast, but they don't invent faster than light travel. Yeah. It's just that they have now, there's a wormhole. They don't know where the wormhole came from. It's just there, and it's out near Saturn.
Yeah. Which would be how, if you're going to travel from one place to the next, that's how you're going to do this. Because if I were to send the fastest thing that's ever been made by humans to the closest star, it would take about 50,000 years.
Yeah. Crazy amount of time.
It's absurd.
Several trillion kilometers. 1 light year is I think 8 something trillion kilometers.
I was trying to look at it like this. The speed of light is so high that if you took a photon and it had 1 second, it could go around the Earth about 7 times.
Right, 300,000
That's 300,000 kilometers per second.
Yeah.
Think of how many seconds are in a minute, how many seconds are in a hour, how many seconds are in a day, all the way out to a year.
Yeah.
Every second is 7 times around the Earth.
Right.
Every second is the amount of miles I have put on my car at this point, and I've had it since 2009.
Yeah. Well, and it's crazy. So the distances, that's obviously a huge problem. So they launch, which it's interesting because the launch is just kind of done in montage, right? Like there's not a big lead up to it. It's not a big dramatic moment. It's just like, okay, here's this very
get in ship, go in space.
Yeah. Which they don't even show like getting in the rocket, right?
No.
And it's just a voiceover from Sir Michael Caine.
Doing Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night," Rage Against the Dying of the Light.
Yeah.
Home. Yes.
Yes, which is fantastic and obviously very poetic, right?
Also, he wrote that poem while his father was dying from cancer.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So the story, it's for his dad, and it's him pleading with his dad to
stay alive
and so it super fits Earth kind of has a cancer at that point.
Well, and especially that there's this father leaving his children, right? And Murphy is 10 at this time.
Murphy's 10.
And she's just, distraught, of course. And Cooper is obviously beside himself. So when this movie came out in 2014, my first daughter had just been born. And I remember, so little behind the scenes, like I remember just bawling.
Absolutely.
Like at the end of this movie.
There are 2 parts in this movie where I have to pretend there are onions in the room. And my daughter, Audrey, is would have been 4 when this came out. And then I watched it. I've watched it a bunch of times, but every single time I'm like, I'm not sure if I could do that.
Yeah, no, like unbelievable, right? So, and this whole concept of like, do we do things for the species? Do we do things for humanity? Or do we do things for the people that are closest to us, the people that we love, right?
Yeah.
And so that whole idea, and of course Murphy's really upset, and I really liked that they go into cryo sleep, which is why we had, I already drank the cryo fluid.
Do you want to talk about cryo sleep for a second?
Oh yeah, yeah, let's do it.
All right, so they're on Earth. They're in science fiction and like Star Trek, which I love. You can get from Earth to Jupiter in like 12 seconds. And that's because you're going faster than the speed of light in Star Trek. But they're obeying the laws of physics as we currently know them mostly.
Yes.
And that means that they have to fly there. And it takes them 2 years to get to Saturn.
Which is hauling, by the way.
Which is
so
incredibly fast. Saturn is...
The Cassini, Saturn's like 1.8 billion kilometers away.
Yeah.
It's like 1 billion miles.
Yeah. If you, like the fastest you can possibly go with our stuff, it's not going to take 2 years.
No.
But they blast off, it takes them 8 months to get to Mars. And then, and I love this, they use Mars's gravity to slingshot them. So what you do, and we absolutely, this is how we hit Pluto with a rocket from 9 years in the past.
Yep.
Is you use the gravity of a planet to speed it up.
Well, what's fascinating is you're actually stealing a little bit of the orbital and rotational energy.
Yes.
Obviously you're tiny. These spacecraft are tiny in comparison to the planet, but you're literally like stealing a little bit of the energy of the rotation and orbit of the planet.
If you had a sensor that's way more sensitive, you would notice that Mars slows down just a teeny bit, which the Earth is slowing down. The Earth is slowing down because the Moon is doing this to us right now.
Exactly.
Now the Moon is a quarter the size of the Earth, so the numbers are teeny tiny, but it is absolutely true.
Right.
So you're using the gravity and the of the planets to accelerate it way faster than you get it going with chemical boosters. And then when you get to a particular angle, you use your own boosters to change your trajectory just slightly, and then you don't fall into the planet. You shoot out towards the thing you want. And so it takes them 14 months from Mars to Saturn. And let's see here, let me do the math. It is 8 times farther, I want to say, to Saturn than it is to Mars.
Yeah, well, and it's so far away. So the last mission to go 8 times...
It's twice as far to Jupiter as it is to Mars, and it's twice as far to Saturn as it is to Jupiter.
Yeah.
So whatever that math is.
Yeah. Because it's too cute.
Assuming you do the most efficient route possible.
Right. Yeah, and the last mission that was sent, that went specifically to Saturn, was Cassini, and it took 7 years, and they used a gravitational assist.
Yeah.
Cassini
was flying.
They used a gravitational assist from Venus, actually, which is crazy.
It shot it back this way.
Yeah, well, because we're in a circle, right? We're in a big circle, so it's not just like a line with like milestones along the way.
But they used Venus, and they had to change the trajectory so it hit it as it's going like that.
In fact, I think it flew by Venus twice. I think that it got 2 gravitational assists.
So they get it, and then they...
It got 2 gravitational assists from Venus to go to Saturn. So using the terrestrial planets, to...
I just always assumed you were going to use Mars, but Venus makes more sense. It has way more
way
gravity.
more mass, yeah, and it's generally closer to us, right? Because we're
It's about half as far as it is to Mars.
yeah, and yeah. So anyway, they get out there, but they have to go into cryosleep, which we have not yet covered.
Because you don't want to be on a spaceship by yourself for 2 years,
Right.
With
Even with just 4 other people.
especially with just 4 other people,
Yeah.
you'll murder each other.
Yeah, and you can't do that.
You can't do that. Humans need to not do this. So they invent cryosleep, and they go into this bed, and there's this liquid in it, and then they get zipped up. And so in my science fiction class, we're like, looked at it, I was like, how does this work? And they're like, I don't know, let's find something in nature that does something similar. And so we looked it up. The closest thing we come up with is frogs.
Yep.
There are particular types of frogs that legit freeze.
Yeah. Alligators do the same.
Alligators can do the same thing. A lot of things do it, but the frogs we found in particular, the way that they do it is leading up to the winter, they build up urea in their cells as well as fructose and glucose, sugars.
Yeah.
Urea is pee, and it's the thing that it's the chemical in pee. And so they're storing their pee in their cells
as an
and
antifreeze.
some sugar, and that changes the freezing point of water, so they don't crystallize and shred their cells. And we looked at that and we said, they're in sugar pea water.
Right. Yeah, well, not only that, they're probably also like intravenous. It would have to be, right? Because if you're going down to like cryo sleep, right? If you're freezing,
you would have to get below freezing, and it would have to get into your system. But I was thinking about this one.
Okay.
There's like, because you don't see anybody have like tubes hooked up to them.
Right.
But they also don't have a respirator device.
Right, and
they're
it fills
breathing in the liquid, and there is a super oxygenated liquid out there.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
That exists that you can breathe.
Yeah, that's in. I
Through
was
your
just reading.
bum, actually.
Most effectively, yes.
Yes.
I was reading The Lost Symbol by Dan Brown, and that's kind of a critical plot driver, is this super oxygenated liquid, and I cannot remember what compound it is.
I can't remember either. I read a paper on it like a year ago.
Yeah,
but it's a real thing. It really exists, and you could breathe it, and you wouldn't. It would be weird. You'd have your lungs all full of liquid. It would probably be really uncomfortable.
Yeah, I would imagine.
And it would be. I
probably
think it's quite viscous, is from what I understand.
Yeah, I would feel like wouldn't the body want to cough?
I would guess. So my other thought is there's probably some sort of anesthetizing device in.
Okay, if you put some sort of like painkiller,
which would put you to sleep.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah. So
that's my theory.
Yeah, that's. And I know that we got our top people working on that. On like cryo sleep.
It would be amazing. Going to Mars. One of the biggest problems with going to Mars is
muscle atrophy and
the
psychological
psychological problem of being in
a box in the
metal tube in the middle of space with 6 other people. And if you've ever been in a small space with anybody, even people you love, your family, if you don't get away from every so often, stuff's going to go down.
Yeah, it makes you crazy.
Like, that is a form of torture.
Yeah. So I feel like the way that they present it is pretty. Nolan, anything that Nolan does is just ridiculously researched, and we'll talk about the actual scientific papers that were published out of this.
Yes, we will.